My name is Len Gable, and even now, nearly a decade later, my hands tremble when I think about what happened in the summer of 2016. Some nights, when the memories creep in uninvited, I sit up in bed, staring at the dark, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. Back then, I was 43, a freelance photographer scraping together a modest living, capturing the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest. My work took me deep into forests and across rugged coastlines, chasing that perfect shot for magazines and calendars. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and it kept me far from the noise of city life. That summer, I'd planned a solo trip to a cabin near the edge of Olympic National Park. It was the kind of place that appealed to me. Simple, secluded, and surrounded by towering evergreens. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Four walls of weathered wood, a tin roof, and a porch barely holding itself together. It had no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. But it was perfect. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, an old-timer named Gus, who had built it decades earlier with his own two hands. When I picked up the keys, Gus gave me one of those long, thoughtful looks. "You'll like it out there," he said, lighting a cigarette with a hand that trembled just slightly. "Quiet, real quiet. Just keep your wits about you, Len. Those woods have seen things people wouldn't believe." I laughed, thinking it was just the ramblings of an old man trying to make his cabin sound more mysterious than it really was. After all, I'd been in plenty of remote places. A bit of solitude was exactly what I needed. The drive out was uneventful, winding roads giving way to gravel as the forest closed in around me. By the time I arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I unloaded my gear and stepped inside. The cabin was just as Gus had described, rustic and bare, with a wood stove, a creaky bed, and a table cluttered with the remnants of previous visits. An old journal sat on the table, its leather cover cracked and worn. I flipped through it absent-mindedly, skimming entries about hunting trips and winters spent snowed in. As night fell, I set about making myself at home. The lantern cast a warm glow, and the wood stove crackled softly as I cooked a simple meal. Outside, the forest seemed alive, the trees swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. It wasn't until I stepped onto the porch after dinner, sipping a cup of coffee and looking up at the stars, that I felt it, the first twinge of unease. The night was unnaturally still. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and went back inside to settle in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified in the silence. Every shift of the shadows outside the window seemed deliberate. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I was startled awake by a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like the sound of someone knocking gently on wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. Grabbing my flashlight, I moved to the window, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but the empty clearing around the cabin. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, as if in response, a new sound came, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from beneath the cabin. The hum resonated through the cabin, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I stood frozen, every instinct telling me to bolt for the door. But where would I go? The nearest town was hours away, and the dense woods outside were an unknown labyrinth. I forced myself to move, grabbing the flashlight and stepping cautiously toward the center of the room. The hum grew louder, pulsating in a way that made my teeth ache. My eyes darted to the floorboards, searching for some explanation. "Stay calm, Len," I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice strangely grounding in the oppressive silence. The flashlight's beam danced across the wooden planks, revealing nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw it. Near the wood stove, one of the floorboards was darker than the others, its edges warped as if it had been burned. Kneeling down, I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the discolored wood. It was warm to the touch, and as I pressed down, the humming intensified. Beneath my palm, the wood vibrated faintly, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. That's when the tapping started again. It wasn't coming from the woods this time. It was coming from under the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. I scrambled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding my attention. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to leave, but something deeper, a mix of morbid curiosity and a photographer's instinct, kept me rooted in place. I grabbed the poker from the wood stove, using it to pry up the warped floorboard. It resisted at first, the wood groaning in protest, but finally it gave way with a sharp crack. What lay beneath made my blood run cold. A narrow crawl space stretched into darkness, its walls lined with jagged stones. But it wasn't the space itself that terrified me. It was what I saw within it. A set of symbols had been carved into the stone floor, intricate and alien, glowing faintly with an otherworldly blue light. The air spilling out from the crawl space was cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. And then I saw the eyes. Two pinpricks of pale, luminous blue stared back at me from the depths, unblinking and inhuman. They were too far apart to belong to any animal I could name, and as they shifted slightly, I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The hum grew louder, joined by a strange, wet, shuffling sound. Whatever was down there was moving. I stumbled backward, the poker slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The noise seemed to agitate the thing below, and the shuffling grew faster, more frantic. "No," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the sound. "This can't be real." But it was real, and it was coming closer. The eyes rose, the creature's form emerging from the crawl space with a fluidity that defied explanation. Its body was pale, almost translucent, and shimmered like water in the moonlight. It moved on elongated limbs, each joint bending at impossible angles, and its head, or what I assumed was its head, was smooth and featureless, save for those piercing blue eyes. It didn't make a sound as it pulled itself into the cabin, but the air grew colder, the hum now a deafening roar. I stumbled toward the door, fumbling with the latch in my panic. Behind me the creature paused, its head tilting in an almost curious manner. "Stay back!" I shouted, grabbing a lantern and swinging it wildly. The flame flickered, casting erratic shadows that only made the creature seem more nightmarish. To my surprise, the light seemed to affect it. The creature recoiled slightly, its form rippling as if disturbed by an unseen force. Seizing the moment, I threw the lantern at its feet, the glass shattering and flames erupting in a brief, brilliant burst. The creature let out a sound, a high-pitched, warbling shriek that rattled my teeth, and recoiled toward the crawl space. As its body dissolved into the shadows, the hum began to fade, leaving behind an eerie silence. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing my bag and keys, I bolted from the cabin, the cold night air stinging my face as I sprinted toward my truck. When I reached the vehicle, I jumped in and turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. As I peeled out onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood in the clearing, dark and lifeless. But for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the doorway. Those pale blue eyes, watching as I disappeared into the forest. The road was a narrow thread winding through an ocean of towering trees, their canopies blotting out the moonlight. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, the truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. The hum still seemed to echo faintly in my ears, though I was miles away from the cabin. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station, a dilapidated outpost on the edge of civilization. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stumbled inside, my mind racing. The clerk, a wiry man with a name tag that read Pete, eyed me warily as I approached the counter. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice scratchy from too many cigarettes. "Something like that," I muttered, glancing over my shoulder at the empty parking lot. "Do you have a payphone?" Pete pointed to a dusty phone booth near the restrooms. I thanked him and fished a handful of quarters from my pocket, my hands still trembling. I dialed Gus's number, the only person who might have answers. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before his gruff voice finally came on the line. "Gus here." "It's Len," I said, my voice cracking. I, I need to know about the cabin." There was a long pause, and when Gus spoke again, his tone was grim. "What happened, Len?" I hesitated, the memory of those glowing eyes flashing in my mind. Something was in the cabin, beneath the floor. It, it wasn't human. Another pause, heavier this time. "Damn it," Gus muttered under his breath. "I was afraid of this." "What do you mean?" I pressed, my frustration mounting. "You knew something was wrong with that place?" "I didn't think it was still there," he admitted. "I thought it was gone." "Gone? What was it, Gus? What's under that cabin?" He sighed, the sound like a weight pressing down on my chest. "It's old, Len. Older than the trees, older than the mountains. My granddad used to talk about the thing in the woods. Said it was some kind of guardian, or maybe a prisoner. Either way, it's not natural." I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people don't believe in that kind of thing anymore," Gus said. "And because if you leave it alone, it usually leaves you alone." Usually. The word hung in the air like a death knell. "Get as far from that place as you can," Gus continued. "And whatever you do, don't go back. Not for anything." I hung up, Gus's warning ringing in my ears, but I couldn't shake the feeling that running wasn't enough. Something about the way the creature had looked at me, its curiosity, its hesitation, made me feel like I was part of this now, whether I wanted to be or not. As I walked back to my truck, Pete called out from behind the counter. "Hey, you said something about a cabin, right?" I stopped, turning to face him. "Yeah, why?" Pete scratched his head, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "People around here talk about a cabin like that. Say it's cursed or haunted. My grandpa used to tell me stories about strange lights and people disappearing in the woods." "Do you know anything else?" I asked, my pulse quickening. He shrugged. "Not much, just that it's bad news. But if you're looking for answers, you might want to talk to old Mabel down in Clearwater. She's into all that spooky stuff, legends, folklore, you name it. Lives in a trailer near the edge of town." Clearwater was about an hour away, and it was already past midnight, but I didn't care. If there was even a chance Mabel could help me understand what I'd seen, I had to take it. The drive to Clearwater was uneventful, though the woods on either side of the road seemed darker than before, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to hide something. When I arrived at Mabel's trailer, the place looked like something out of a horror movie. The yard was littered with rusted car parts, wind chimes made of animal bones clinking softly in the breeze. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a frail woman with wild gray hair and piercing green eyes. "You're not from around here," she said, studying me with an unsettling intensity. "No," I admitted, "but I need your help. I think, I think I've seen something." Mabel gestured for me to come inside, and I hesitated before stepping into the dimly lit trailer. The air smelled of incense and something earthy, like dried herbs. She motioned for me to sit, then pulled a battered notebook from a shelf. "Start from the beginning," she said. I told her everything. The hum, the crawl space, the creature. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing graver with each detail. When I finished, she opened the notebook, flipping through pages filled with sketches and notes in a shaky hand. Finally, she stopped on a page depicting symbols eerily similar to the ones I'd seen beneath the cabin. "It's an old seal," she said, tracing one of the drawings with her finger. "A barrier meant to contain something powerful, something dangerous." "Contain it," I repeated, my stomach twisting. "You mean it's trapped?" She nodded. "Or at least it was. If you've seen it, that means the seal is weakening. And if it gets out completely—" Her voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mabel's eyes locked onto mine. "You don't do anything, son. You stay away. Let sleeping devils lie." I left Mabel's trailer with more questions than answers. Her words echoed in my head. Let sleeping devils lie. But something inside me couldn't. I'd seen the creature. It had looked at me, as if it were aware of me. Gus's warning, Pete's stories, Mabel's cryptic explanations, they all pointed to one thing. The cabin wasn't just cursed, it was a door to something ancient, something terrifying. I knew I should walk away, leave it behind and never look back. But the pull was too strong. I couldn't ignore the feeling that if I didn't act, the thing beneath the cabin might not stay contained. By the time I reached the motel on the outskirts of Clearwater, dawn was breaking. I sat on the bed staring at the sunrise through a crack in the curtains. The symbols from Mabel's notebook burned into my memory. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I spent the morning gathering supplies, flashlights, batteries, rope, and, reluctantly, a firearm. I'd never been comfortable with guns, but after seeing that thing in the cabin, I wasn't taking any chances. By mid-afternoon, I found myself parked at the edge of the forest road, leading back to the cabin. The truck idled as I gripped the wheel, my stomach churning. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't shake the thought that if I didn't do something, someone else might stumble upon it. Or worse, it might escape. The hike to the cabin was eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood there, silent and foreboding. The door hung slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The crawl space was exactly as I'd remembered, the symbols etched into the wood faint but still visible. But now there were new markings, deep gouges in the floorboards as if something had tried to claw its way out. I knelt by the opening, my flashlight illuminating the space below. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the hum was louder now, almost like a chant. It seemed to vibrate through the floor, filling my chest with an unbearable pressure. As I reached for the edge of the crawl space, I noticed something strange. My hand was trembling, but not from fear. It was as if the hum was affecting my muscles, pulling me toward the opening. I pulled back, my breath coming in short gasps. Whatever was down there was getting stronger. I had to act. I spent hours scouring the forest for the materials Mabel had mentioned. Branches from a yew tree, river stones, and a bundle of sage. She hadn't given me a detailed ritual, but her warnings about the seal had been clear. It needed to be reinforced. As dusk fell, I returned to the cabin, my makeshift tools in hand. The air inside was colder than before, and the hum had grown into a deep, resonant thrum that made my teeth ache. I arranged the materials around the crawl space in a rough circle, my hands shaking as I murmured the words Mabel had scrawled in the margins of her notebook. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly, as if responding to the ritual. But as I finished the last chant, a low growl echoed from beneath the cabin. The flashlight flickered and the temperature plummeted. Something was coming. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the cabin like thunder. I scrambled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The floorboards near the crawl space began to warp, as though something massive was pressing against them from below. "Stay back," I shouted, though the words felt hollow in the oppressive silence. The wood splintered, and the creature emerged, its form even more terrifying than before. Its translucent flesh seemed to ripple with unearthly energy, its many eyes glowing with that pale, corpse-light blue. I raised the gun, firing a shot into its shifting mass. The creature recoiled, letting out a piercing screech that made my ears ring. But just like before, the wound closed almost instantly, the ripples in its flesh smoothing out as if nothing had happened. I backed toward the door, but the creature moved with impossible speed, cutting off my escape. Its long, spindly limbs seemed to stretch and contract, filling the cabin with its presence. Desperate, I grabbed the bundle of sage and lit it, waving the smoldering herbs in front of me. To my surprise, the creature hesitated, its movements faltering as the smoke filled the room. I seized the moment, chanting the words from Mabel's notebook with all the force I could muster. The creature thrashed, its form destabilizing, its many eyes flickering like dying embers. The symbols on the floor began to glow brighter, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and I could feel the cabin itself trembling under the strain. With one final, ear-splitting screech, the creature collapsed in on itself, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of light and shadow. The energy surged upward, vanishing through the roof in a burst of blinding light. And then, silence. I sat on the floor, my chest heaving, the smell of burnt sage and scorched wood filling the air. The symbols on the floor were faint once more, the glow extinguished. I didn't know if the creature was truly gone or merely contained again, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I packed what little I had brought and left the cabin behind, the oppressive weight lifting as I moved farther from the clearing. When I reached the truck, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let out a shaky breath. I didn't call Gus or Mabel to tell them what had happened. Some things are better left unsaid. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of that creature. That whatever it was, it had marked me. Even now, years later, I can still hear the faint hum when the world goes quiet. I tried to leave that cabin and the horrors I'd faced behind me, but it didn't let me go. Weeks turned into months, and while the world around me moved on, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The faint hum I'd heard in the cabin now followed me everywhere. In my apartment, on quiet streets, even in crowded cafes. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then, the dreams started. In my sleep, I was back in the cabin, standing over the crawl space as the creature's many eyes stared up at me. I would wake drenched in sweat, the echo of its inhuman screech ringing in my ears. Every night, the dreams grew more vivid, until I wasn't sure if they were dreams at all. And then the sightings began. It started small, shadows moving at the edges of my vision, a chill in the air where there shouldn't be one. But soon it escalated. One night, as I walked home from the corner store, I saw it, a pale, translucent figure standing beneath a flickering streetlight. Its blank face turned toward me, and for a moment, I felt the same paralyzing fear I'd experienced in the cabin. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the hum growing louder with every step. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle, as if that would stop it. I knew then that it wasn't over. The seal I'd reinforced hadn't held. The creature, or perhaps something worse, had followed me. Desperate for answers, I reached out to Mabel. I hadn't spoken to her since that day at her trailer, but when I called, she answered on the first ring. "I told you not to go back," she said, her voice a mix of anger and fear. "I didn't have a choice," I replied, "and now it's here. It's following me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "Come back. There's something you need to see." When I arrived at her trailer, Mabel was waiting for me on the porch, a shotgun resting across her lap. She looked older, more worn, as if the weight of her knowledge was finally catching up to her. She led me inside, where the walls were now covered with maps, diagrams, and faded photographs. At the center of it all was a large hand-drawn chart depicting the area around the cabin. "The seal wasn't just a barrier," she explained. "It was a tether. The creature isn't bound to the cabin. It's bound to you now." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? How do I stop it?" "You can't," she said bluntly. "Not alone. But there's a place deep in the forest where the seal was first created. If we can get there and perform the ritual properly, we might be able to sever the connection." "Might?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. The journey to the site was grueling. Mabel and I set out at dawn, armed with her shotgun, my flashlight, and a satchel of supplies she'd prepared. More sage, ceremonial tools, and a small, weathered book filled with handwritten incantations. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved deeper into its heart. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The hum followed us, growing louder the closer we got. As night fell, the forest came alive with unnatural sounds. Whispers carried on the wind, the crack of branches with no visible source. "We're close," Mabel said, her voice barely audible over the hum. Finally, we reached a clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time but still imposing. Symbols similar to those I'd seen in the cabin were carved into its surface, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "This is it," Mabel said. "Help me set up." As we arranged the supplies, the air grew colder, and the hum became a deafening roar. Shadows began to move at the edges of the clearing, coalescing into shapes that were disturbingly familiar. Long, spindly limbs, blank faces, too many eyes. "They're trying to stop us," Mabel said, lighting the sage and chanting from her book. I raised the flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The shadows advanced, their forms shifting and twisting in ways that made my head spin. Mabel's voice grew louder, her chant rising above the hum. The symbols on the altar flared to life, their glow illuminating the clearing. The creatures recoiled, their screeches filling the night. But they didn't retreat. As Mabel continued the ritual, I felt a sudden, searing pain in my chest. I looked down to see the faint outline of the symbols from the cabin burned into my skin, glowing with the same eerie light as the altar. "It's binding to you," Mabel shouted. "You have to finish the ritual." "What about you?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. "Just do it," she screamed, shoving the book into my hands. The creatures were almost upon us now, their forms solidifying as they closed in. I fumbled with the book, my trembling hands struggling to find the right page. Finally, I began to chant, the words foreign and guttural in my mouth. The pain in my chest intensified, spreading through my entire body. The altar's glow became blinding, and the creatures let out a unified, ear-piercing wail. Their forms began to unravel, disintegrating into wisps of shadow that were drawn into the altar like smoke. As I spoke the final words, the light exploded outward, knocking me to the ground. When I woke, the clearing was silent. The altar was dark, its symbols faded. Mabel lay motionless beside it, her face peaceful. I staggered to my feet, my body aching. The hum was gone, but as I looked down at my hands, I saw faint traces of the symbols still etched into my skin, glowing softly in the moonlight. The connection was severed, but the mark remained.